All right, humbly thanking God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit this time for, once again, as we from time to time say, the way that they can help us prioritize. Let's look at Philippians chapter 2 through the theme of his own. As Paul, in the first 11 verses, is going to encourage them somewhat famously not to look out for their own interests in verse 4. And he is going to likewise conclude the chapter talking about two servants who actually seem to have overcome the temptation to be preoccupied by their own interests, as he is going to turn attention to Timothy and Epaphroditus, specifically stating that Timothy has proved himself trustworthy because, unlike seemingly other servants, even those who are devoted to the work of God, he is not seeking his own interest and genuinely cares for the church at Philippi. But breaking it down paragraph by paragraph as the ESV has it, verses 1 through 11 are indeed going to build that point about not looking to their own interest by talking about the way that in humility they should build upon the principle of having the same mind, the same love, being in full accord of one mind, building off of what he seems to have talked about in chapter 1. As we've said, not addressing the Philippians as a troubled congregation as much as a church that has a lot going on. And unlike the Corinthians who had a lot going on, but allowed that to produce disputes, he simply seems to be encouraging the Philippians to build upon the successes that they've realized in loving one another by maintaining those characteristics. Understanding that, much like he wrote to the Corinthians at length and the Ephesians at least at length, paragraphs or really chapters devoted to things like not allowing their debates to become huge rifts, not allowing their disputes over which preacher they prefer to become a thing, and then likewise not becoming so pugnacious, for lack of a better term, that they carried their disputes into the courts. That was a problem at Corinth. But even at Ephesus, he talked about things like needing to make sure that they understood that the middle wall of separation had been removed between Hebrew and Gentile, which isn't all that different from what he wrote to the church at Rome, many of whom he had specific words of commendation for, but they were likewise in a situation where it seemed that there was a rift between the people of Israel who were now claiming Christ or accepting Christ as the Messiah and those amongst the Gentiles who had done the same. But whereas he devoted chapters at some points to the divisions in each of those groups, he simply gives us roughly 10 verses reminding them. And that's what makes it seem like, at least to me, that he's building off of a healthy foundation in the church at Philippi, among other things. But as he will, like we said, build on that concept of reminding them to have the same mind, the same love, being in full accord and one mind, he's going to tell them not to do anything out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility to count others as more significant than themselves. As we get to our subject first, where he says, let each of you look not to his own interest, but also to the interest of others, building on a theme that we have seen, as we said, through pretty much each epistle that we have talked about to this point. He is then going to go on and draw on the example of Christ, saying that Christ set an example of selflessness for them, talking about the way that he not only humbled himself, but to the point of being obedient to death, even what seems to be a humiliating death, he's going to describe as even death on a cross in verse 8. He's going to say the benefit, or one of the benefits, is beyond the help that he is able to give to us after having suffered so much in this life. Now he is in a situation where in verse 9, God has highly exalted him to a point where every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. Understanding that this paragraph sounds much like what we're going to see others write when Peter's going to say, humble yourself, and in due time, God will exalt you. And likewise, James is going to seem to say something similar. This is going to seem to be Paul offering that same encouragement through the life of Christ, helping us to understand that even though he humbled himself, he now sits at rest, exalted above all those things that trouble him in this life. Likewise, it can be an encouragement for us to understand that the humility that God calls us to is not eternal humiliation. It is a period of humility where we help others who are struggling, as we've talked about in other discussions, so that he can then exalt us all to a life eternal beyond the drama that we have to endure here. Beyond that, though, he is going to go on in verses 12 through 13 to give a therefore, understanding that Christ overcame in a way that has him exalted. Now he's going to say, therefore, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Going on to say, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Once again, helping us to prioritize, understanding that, much like Paul wrote to the Galatians, that it is no longer I, Paul, who live, but Christ who lives in me. Once again, the same man who told the Corinthians that told the Corinthians to imitate him as he imitates Christ, is likewise giving them an example here. That just as Paul has offered himself, even if it's an example to another congregation, as one who no longer lives for himself, but Christ lives in him, he is now calling this congregation of believers, the Philippians, to embrace that same mindset. As in verses 14 through 18, he is going to caution them about things that can trouble the light that he is going to call them to shine in this generation in verse 15. By verse 14 saying, do all things without grumbling and disputing, so that you may be found blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, in which he hopes that they will shine as lights, holding fast to the word of life that later on he's going to describe as the word of truth. As he will then, like we said, shift into giving them examples of those who seem to have devoted themselves to Christ in a way that has overcome their own self-interest. Understanding that we all have self-interest, he doesn't say get rid of your self-interest. He says look not only to your own self-interest in verse 4, but also the interest of others. Giving us Timothy as an example of that in verses 19 through 24. He is going to talk about Timothy being especially valuable, because in verse 21, for they all seek their own interest, not those of Jesus Christ. Not clear about who he's talking about when he says the they, but in context, it seems like it might be Timothy's peer group, others who have possibly committed themselves to the word of God or doing God's work, but might not have attained the level of devotion that men like Timothy have because they've overcome their own self-interest. Understanding that Paul in the last chapter talked about those who are preaching actually to try to make Paul's days or his time of incarceration more difficult. He's saying, but even in those ill motives in chapter 1, God still gets wins because the word is still being preached. And so now it seems that it is not only Paul that seems to be preaching in an environment where not everybody who is doing the work is actually doing it out of healthy motives. Likewise, he's saying there seem to be others in Timothy's peer group who are not quite as devoted in purity to genuinely being concerned about the welfare of God's people, the way that Timothy would, as he's going to say in verse 20, for I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. But understanding that Timothy is not the only one, he is then going to turn to Epaphroditus, who he is going to commend to them in verses 25 through the end of the chapter, verse 30, where he is going to say Epaphroditus cared so much for their welfare that he almost gave his life on their behalf. And understanding these two, they remind me of what Elijah went through when he was in such despair that he called out to God, I think from the cave, saying that there is no one left. And God reminded him that he still had 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal. Ideally, they never would. Understanding the end of this chapter reminds me that much like Elijah was so involved in the work of the Lord that he was not necessarily aware of those others who, like him, had a genuine concern and a loyalty to God, genuine concern for the work of God and a loyalty to God. Likewise, we see them scattered. Paul incarcerated, Timothy likely in one place, and Epaphroditus likely moving back and forth between the congregations. Understanding that, just like Jesus said, the work is plentiful, but the workers are few. There are others who are at work, seemingly isolated sometimes, working for God in a way where they're so focused on what's going on that they might not have the benefit of the encouragement of others who are also just as concerned for the work of the Lord. Which reminds me, quite simply, that might be a word of encouragement for each of us. There are times in life when we might have the benefit of fellowship with others who are going through some of the same stresses, if they haven't already been through some of the same stresses that we're going through, those who can encourage us. We're blessed when we are in those periods of our life, but as we see here, those times aren't certain, because later epistles are going to be words of encouragement, not just to churches who seem like they are on the right path, but some of Paul's most famous epistles are to Timothy, encouraging him as an individual who's going to seem to be, as Paul is writing to him in those personal epistles, in an environment where he might be feeling the isolation of the ministry that he is in at that particular time. But nestled in between the opening and closing encouragements to overcome selfish ambition seems to be a symptom of selfish ambition in verse 14, as we've already mentioned, the grumbling and disputing that he is telling them to avoid. That seems to be one of the byproducts of the grumbling, or sorry, the self-interest that was a factor or a thing in Corinth. Understanding that both of those things were a factor. One, Paul specifically going at them being overwhelmed or overcome with the self-interest that went along with having too much pride in their abilities, manifesting itself in different forms of disputes, if nothing else, and disputes that quite possibly manifested in grumbling as well. But the net effect is here. It seems to be one of the things that Paul says will diminish their ability to shine as lights in an otherwise crooked and twisted generation. Understanding that the grumbling and disputing might simply cause them, no matter what they call themselves, as we said before, no matter what we call ourselves as the people of God or Christians, if we are locked in grumbling and disputing, that can be one of the things that causes us to blend in with the culture around us that already has enough grumbling and disputing going on already. So likewise, it seems to be one of those things that transcend generations. Just as Paul is warning them that, or like I said, seems to be warning them that grumbling and disputing is one of those things that can cause them to blend into the background of that culture, even though they call themselves Christians. Grumbling and disputing is one of those things that likewise can cause us to blend into the culture, as opposed to standing out as being significantly distinct in the way that we carry ourselves as God's people, which is why we often say God's best to you as you go forward with him, God willing, overcoming the temptations to engage in the kinds of conflicts that can lead to the grumbling and disputing that can keep us from looking like a healthy alternative to the things that are troubling so many in the world already.